Welcome to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. How will the future of immigration affect American housing? And then which U.S. cities are poised for real estate prosperity and which ones are doomed? It's the confluence of real estate investing, geography, and geopolitics. It's how America works with a great guest today on Get Rich Education. MC Laubscher is the host of the Cashflow Ninja podcast and president of Producers Wealth. He is on a mission to help you achieve financial independence and freedom as soon as possible. He achieves this by integrating the infinite banking concept with real estate investments to increase your returns and recapture cash flow that you are not even aware of that you're losing. MC shares the number one strategy of investors in his holistic wealth creation course at yourownbankingsystem.com.
Learn the easiest way to create wealth and passive income with real estate. Now you can access the best deals without the stress or hassle of having to find, renovate, or manage those investment properties. Norada Real Estate saves you time by providing you with passive income investment properties in some of the best U.S. markets. Learn more at PassiveRealEstateInvesting.com and download your free copy of the ultimate guide to passive real estate investing. There's no obligation and nothing to buy. Simply visit PassiveRealEstateInvesting.com.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE, from the brick city of Newark, New Jersey to the rose city of Portland, Oregon, and across 188 nations worldwide. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold, and this is a decidedly geography-centric weekly installment of Get Rich Education, episode 237. If you think of your real estate portfolio as a series of concentric rings, well, the outermost ring is comprised of what we discussed here last week with how the world economy works. Okay, an interest rate change at the European Central Bank, for example, has an effect on you, but it's minuscule. This week, at least for Americans, we come in one ring closer to you as we discuss national trends and how this affects your real estate. Next week, we're going to shoot substantially closer to the center of the beating heart of your portfolio and those specific actions that you can take to build wealth. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm so sleepy that I can't keep my eyes open any longer, all you have to do is just bring me a nice, colorful map that I've never seen before, and I'm very likely to just lie on top of the comforter, look at the map, and be awake for another hour. Well, in today's hyper-connected world, geography means less to humans than it's ever meant before. But it still matters. And in the real estate world, geography really still matters. Yeah, geography and real estate are both location, location, location. Now, to pick on Americans a little, which I can do because I am one, there are some subjects where we're generally lacking in education and understanding. Come on, you know that we are. One of those is finances, which we primarily address here at Get Rich Education. Another is probably English, grammar, and syntax. A third place we're lacking is in geography knowledge. In English, it might be social media and texting either exposing or exacerbating the fact that many born and raised in the U.S. still don't know how to use the word then from than. Or maybe it's adding a needless apostrophe onto a plural non-possessive noun. For example, if there's a sign in the grocery store with two words, fresh bananas on it, no apostrophe belongs there. There are no criterias out there. Criteria is the plural, criterion is the singular. And what about literally versus figuratively? How many times has a person told you that an investing concept literally blew them away? Well, gosh, where did they end up landing? And were they okay afterward? Well, similarly, Americans are lacking in geography knowledge. Houston, Texas is not on a coast. It's not on the Gulf of Mexico at all. Neither is New Orleans. Portland, Oregon isn't on any coast either. It's inland too. I actually think that the most surprising lack of Americans' geography knowledge is the lack of understanding of New York City. Now, we are not talking about some far-flung hodunk place here. This is New York City, not just the American capital, but in some cases the world capital of finance and real estate and design and fashion and culture, and even known colloquially really as the center of the universe. Some Americans can't even name New York's 5 boroughs, let alone where they're located at all. Manhattan is on its own island called Manhattan Island. The borough of Staten Island is on its own separate island. Brooklyn and Queens are both on Long Island, and the Bronx is the only New York borough that's on the United States mainland. They are the 5 boroughs. That's why you drive across all those bridges in New York City. Harlem is not a borough. I'm not even talking about remotely discussing any intricate details or history here. This is just the general layout of the biggest and most influential city in all of America and maybe the world. If you're a Get Rich Education listener, then you're into real estate and finance, and that really puts an emphasis on knowing just the most general overview of New York City. And if you haven't been there and don't know where to start, a company like Onboard Tours does a great one-day Manhattan tour where you get around the borough on foot, by boat, and with a shuttle bus. Start there. The Statue of Liberty, the Freedom Tower, Rockefeller Center, Times Square, Wall Street, the Empire State Building. It's springtime, so if you haven't, especially if you're an American or into real estate, check out New York. Chances are you're going to love it. But hey, I'm no guru on all things geography and grammar either. Look, I write real estate articles for Forbes, and I still have a hard time discerning whether to use affect or effect in a sentence, okay? Let's talk about real estate and geography with the incomparable Peter Zeihan. My geography is that I'm here in beautiful and pristine Anchorage, Alaska today. Peter joins us from near Austin, Texas. Today's guest helps you make sense of the world. He's a critically acclaimed author whose books like The Accidental Superpower and The Absent Superpower have been recommended by people like Mitt Romney. And he is a highly sought-after public speaker with a keen eye toward what will drive tomorrow's headlines. And he's got this irreverent approach that takes these topics that are normally pretty dense and heavy, and he distills them down into takeaways that you can access very easily. Welcome back to Get Rich Education, Peter Zeihan.
It's good to be back.
Peter, last week we talked about how the world works. Today we're talking about how America works, especially with economic factors and how that relates to United States real estate investors. So talk to us about some of the effects of immigration and how that can change not just the demographics, but the demand for housing going forward in the United States.
The United States is unique in that it really has 2 different immigration flows. Most countries, it's a question of who happens to be relatively proximate, and that limits the potential impact of immigration because, as a rule, countries that directly border each other tend to be of a similar socioeconomic status, and so you don't usually get a huge amount of flow between them. Now, the United States is different. Its immediate neighbor, Mexico, is a country with a significantly different socioeconomic structure. And as a result, we have a kind of a mentality in this country that most of the Mexicans that cross from Mexico to the United States tend to be less educated, less skilled, and so fill a very specific labor niche in the United States. It's not that assessment is entirely wrong. There's actually quite a bit to it, but it does forget a couple of very specific points that are unique to the North American geography and economy. First of all, Mexico is not a unified place. If you're talking about the part of Mexico that is more advanced, that does most of the manufacturing value added, the areas right around the core of Mexico City, they've got a much higher standard of living than Mexico as an average, and they're also far less likely to migrate. So the ones that kind of consider themselves the peers to the Americans, they don't move all that much. The people in Mexico and Central America who do relocate are the people from southern Mexico that are not really tightly integrated in the Mexican system. And these are the folks that kind of meet that mindset of relatively lower skilled, relatively lower paid. And they certainly make up the bulk of what we think of as the undocumented population here in the United States. Now, the United States still gets that second chunk of migration, relatively skilled people from the world over. In terms of numbers, it's smaller. In terms of educational levels, it's higher than the American average. So you got these 2 flows. Now play that across where we're going as a country and as a world. Skilled migration is primarily based on hardcore opportunity. Not so much, can I do better in this country than my current country, but can I do so much better that it is worth the upheaval that will hit my personal life?
Right.
That tends to be a smaller flow, and it tends to only happen in times of huge international upheaval. So we have not seen a lot of that since 1960. As the global order kicked in, the world kind of settled. The European and the Asian systems stopped fighting each other, and everyone saw some pretty broad-based economic growth. So we have seen our immigration of that, what we think of as top tier, I guess, become smaller and smaller and smaller as the years have gone on. That's about to change. As the Americans back away from the global order, the stability and wealth that has defined, especially places like Western Europe and the East Asian Rim, is going to go away. And we're going to see a huge surge in skilled, high-tier migration of the type that we have not seen in this country since the mid-1800s, when the Europeans were having all their civil wars, Germany in particular. So we're about to see a surge in what Donald Trump would consider good immigration, but it will happen because most of the world's catching on fire. The other half of that, the less skilled migration that's coming from southern Mexico and Central America, that's about to stop. And not because of a wall or harsh immigration policies or a little bit more funding to ICE. That's going to stop because of a demographic bust that's in progress. The developed world had a demographic bust that started, based on where you are, between 1970 and 1990. And that's one of the reasons why demographics in Japan and Germany are so atrocious. But it hit the developing world as well just 20 years later. So net migration from Mexico has actually been negative for 9 years now. And peak migration from Central America will probably happen next year. And it's only going to go down from there. When you're talking about the profile of migration that's hitting the United States, it's about to evolve substantially to something that's less familiar of us in our lives and something more familiar to something our great-grandparents would have recognized. We're going to see more Germans with doctorates and more French architects and more Chinese accountants coming in than unskilled day laborers. And that's going to change everything from the way our political system works to the way our real estate market works.
Having skilled, high-tier labor type of immigrants can definitely make some people feel differently about immigration than they do now. And one gateway city and one immigration hub, as we're just talking geographically now about how America works, is New York City. Talk to us about the economic fortunes of New York City in the near term. I know here we've seen some cracks in Manhattan's high-end real estate market. I don't know if that's symptomatic of anything larger. Tell us what you think about New York City's economic fortunes.
Well, even in a dull year, New York City has a lot going on. So let me try to kind of put this into a few basic buckets. Step one, New York City is either the number one or number two destination for capital flight into the United States. And that has pushed so much money into real estate that you've seen those sky-high prices. And because a lot of the higher-end condos are unoccupied because they're just designed to be sinks of value, you got a bubble. Eventually, people who are investing in that specific tier think that the prices have gotten too much and they go elsewhere. And that starts a bit of a cavalcade, and that's what we've seen in the last 12 months. So yes, the bubble is popping in New York City. It is affecting the upper end of the property spectrum. And all that's happened now is that the foreign money is relocating from New York to other cities, secondary cities. So we've probably seen the peak or the near peak in the gateway cities of Miami and Santa Monica and Seattle, San Francisco, and New York. And now we're seeing the money flow into the next wave, places like Charleston and Dallas-Fort Worth and Denver, places that most foreigners don't think of until they do a little bit of research. And they're like, oh, there's 4 million people there. I'll go there too. That's kind of piece one. Piece two, New York State, the Northeast in general, and New York City in specific have rapidly aging demographies.
Yeah.
They are not absorbing the number of youth in terms of immigration that they used to, and they're not generating their own. So it's actually the fastest aging part of the country. And that changes the profile of the real estate business, because if you don't have a lot of 20 and 30 somethings coming in and establishing themselves, then you don't have a growing real estate market from a demand perspective. And that will also tend to take some of the air out of the system. I don't mean to suggest that New York City is going to die or anything like that. This is not Detroit. But the broad-based dynamic growth that we're used to seeing in New York is something that is driven by factors that are no longer applying. And as New York City living costs continue to skyrocket, you're going to see more and more people relocating from the city to some place that they can actually afford to live. And that makes places that are outside of the city look more and more attractive. I mean, nobody moves to New Jersey because they love New Jersey. They move to New Jersey because they can afford to live in New Jersey. And this is another thing that is really strongly benefiting a lot of the secondary cities across the world and in the United States, because the advance of digital technologies are allowing people to work from more diversified location set. And that makes the concentration of capital and talent in New York not as important as it used to be. It's not that it's not a winning combination. It's just not critical like it used to be. And you're going to see that reflect in the real estate market as well. Then finally, manufacturing. New York has some of the world's more stringent regulations. It's not exactly a business-friendly place because a lot of the environmentalism and activism that you see in New York City does not necessarily translate well to the rest of the state. New York City demographically, politically, really is the center of power of the state, but most people don't live in the rest of the state. So it's hard for the state to compete. Whereas if you move into, say, the South and Texas and the Great Plains, you get places that are much more eager to take steps to attract investment. And that makes it easier to really direct your manufacturing supply chains into different locations. And that makes places like Alabama look, honestly, a lot more attractive than places like New York State when you're talking about the desire of kind of having a more broad-based economy with a more of a manufacturing base. New York is still great for services. It's still going to do well. It still has all the capital flight coming in from the rest of the world, but it is no longer the end-all and the be-all. One of the reasons that Texas succeeds when it comes to manufacturing is that Texans don't believe in government, like really at all. The state government here meets for 35 days every other year, and it's constitutionally prohibited from even considering legislation for the first half of that 35 days. The state footprint in Texas is nearly non-existent. Pretty much all the decisions are made at the local level. And if you get a local government that is willing to throw open the doors, that can work really, really well. But if you need, say, a light rail system, it's almost a disaster because there's just no coordination among the governments because there really aren't any governments.
Now, only 95 miles away from New York City is Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, either the fifth or sixth largest city in the United States, depending on how you slice it. But real estate prices, especially in the inner city, are substantially lower in Philadelphia than they are in New York City. So just talk to us about the economic fortunes of Philadelphia, especially as it relates to its real estate market.
Let me start with the geographic story. Philly should be an economic powerhouse. It has deep water ocean access. It is proximate to some of the most densely populated parts of the United States. It has everything that it needs to thrive. But Philly has all of the negative aspects of what is going on with New York right now when it comes to immigration, population structure, and regulation, but none of the benefits. It's not a world-class city. It doesn't have those financial flows coming in. It doesn't have a property market that people think of as a sink of value. And so until you have policy changes in Philadelphia that allow it to take advantage of its physical location, you're going to continue to see the place hollow out.
Philadelphia is interesting. It's not actually a coastal city. A lot of people think it is, but it's on the Delaware estuary. It's got substantial infrastructure, and it's got proximity. It's got about 5 million people in the metro area, but yeah, I think of it as one of the more unsung cities, and people still, 40, 50 years after the Rocky movie came out, correlate Philadelphia with Rocky.
Well, not to put too fine a point on it, but that was probably the heyday. We've seen a series of regulations get adopted in Pennsylvania in general and Philadelphia specifically, especially as regards environmental and union movements that have pretty much driven everybody out. And it's under that same 50-year time span that the South has gone the opposite direction. And so anything where mobility is possible and the finance is flexible and regulations play a role, Philadelphia it seems to be intent to putting itself at the bottom of the list. And that has now been reflected for several decades.
Let's keep moving southwest. Talk to us about Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C. is obviously a government town. And the two big booms we saw in Washington, D.C. were first during the global war on terror, when you had a huge buildup in government activity, particularly on the Virginia side of the border, as the Americans went to having 200,000 troops overseas. The logistical tail for that is huge. The analytical tail for that is huge. And you saw a huge amount of money coming to the Pentagon area and related industries to take advantage of that. The second big boom came with the Obama years and the general expansion of the federal footprint when it came to regulation and laws and interpretation and enforcement. So two huge booms, over each of them roughly lasted a decade, that needed more money, more government largesse, more workers in the DC metro area. And so the place did really well. They also had a series of pretty good governors over that period that kind of brought it back from the brink after some of the, how should we say, less ill-tempered governments of the 1980s and 1990s. The period's over. The Americans now have fewer troops stationed overseas than at any time since 1942. And the Trump administration, whether you consider this a plus or a minus, is in the process of completely deregulating the system. They're not enforcing the regulations that are on the books. They're stripping as many of them out as they can. The number of people that you need to take a scalpel to that sort of system is small. The number of people that you need to enforce that sort of system is large. So DC has to face this massive contraction in government demand for all of the things that have made DC a hotbed for the last 20 years. Now, that'll provide opportunities for anyone who wants to move into that space, and we've seen tech expand. But the contraction in demand from the government is going to be much faster than the expansion of other private sector in moving into the empty space.
Let's move west. Talk to us about the economic fortunes of Cleveland, Ohio. We're talking about a city that's on a Great Lake, that's had more medical job inflows recently than they have in the past. Tell us about Cleveland.
Cleveland's doing a pretty good job of reinventing itself. And it used to be an old Rust Belt city. It used to be a major hub for airlines, and it basically lost all that. It and Pittsburgh are both doing a pretty good job of reinventing themselves with more technologically advanced services-based industries. Now, these jobs are more flexible, they're more diversified, they don't pop up nearly as quick, and if a specific company goes out of business or leaves, they don't have nearly the same downside. They're both becoming kind of a reinvented American city in the new style. And I bet if you went into Cleveland and asked them to name the top 10 employers, most people couldn't name more than 2 or 3. This is good. Because whenever you have smaller, medium-sized businesses taking over from what used to be a few large employers, it just makes for a much more stable employment base, more stable wages, and a broader diversification of the system.
Let's keep moving west to a situation that's probably not as upbeat as Cleveland's situation, and that is Chicago, Illinois, the third largest city in the United States. They're on Lake Michigan. We've seen substantial flight out of Chicago. You know, it's interesting, Peter. One of our real estate providers is in northwesternmost Indiana, and they're really benefiting from people moving across the state line from Chicago to northwest Indiana for a lower tax climate and a better quality of life. But tell us about Chicago.
I would say that Chicago, and from a broader point of view, Illinois' core problem, it's political. The pension system that the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago have found themselves in is absolutely irrecoverable. The Supreme Court of Illinois has ruled that they can't forcibly renegotiate the pension systems as they exist, which means that the state of Chicago, or the state of Illinois, is now on par to have all revenues gobbled up by pensions. And that means no city services, that means no infrastructure maintenance, that means no schools. Obviously, that can't happen, and they don't have a path forward. We have complete political gridlock, and if you were a business based in Chicago or Illinois, or if you were living in Chicago or elsewhere in Illinois, you take note of this. It's not a new problem. It's gotten steadily worse over the last decade, and every effort to try to remedy it has collapsed and ultimately been ruled by the Supreme Court to be unconstitutional. I don't see how they come out of this without some sort of national declaration of emergency. But we're still a couple years away from that, and until that happens, I see absolutely no reason why the situation in Chicago should get any better. We don't have a legal path. We don't have a financial path. We don't have a fiscal path out of this. It's going to require a political decision from the very top that overrules the Supreme Court itself. The only way that that can happen is a request from the president and ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's kind of a big deal.
We're talking with Peter Zeihan about how America works. Yes, it's another one of those episodes where Peter's back and you may very well be drawing a mental map in your mind. We're going to continue with that when we come back as we talk about more areas of the United States South and the U.S. West. You're listening to Get Rich Education. Finally, Total Control Financial gives you checkbook control of your 401k and IRA money to invest in real estate. It's time to get your retirement money into your own checking account, but you've got to avoid the little-known tax that you'll pay with any self-directed IRA. Instead, it's time for the QRP. Learn more and get your free copy of the QRP book by text messaging QRP in all capital letters to 72,000. For a real estate investor like you seeking an income property loan, go to Ridge Lending Group, NMLS 42056. Over the years, you've heard President Chaley Ridge generously devote her time to you here on the show as a guest. Ridge provides investment property loans in most U.S. states, and you're going to find out how they've helped more people realize their dreams of real estate financial freedom than any other mortgage lender in the entire nation when you get started at ridgelendinggroup.com.
This is Peak Prosperity's Chris Martinson. Listen to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold and don't quit your daydream.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education. We're talking with Peter Zeihan about how America works. Learn more about him at Zeihan.com, Zeihan.com. Peter, talk to us about the economic fortunes of Florida. And I want to focus specifically on areas north of Miami, since that's a pretty highly priced real estate market where it's difficult to get cash flow. Any particular thoughts about the state as a whole, or Jacksonville, Orlando, or Tampa?
These are all boom towns, and I expect them to be for a good time. All of them are seeing strong inward growth as Americans are finding air conditioning more affordable and would just like to be in warmer climates in general. And as the baby boomers continue their long march towards retirement, all of these places look like they're going to do really well. You're going to have a lot of fractionalization within the market, because what a boomer moving into retirement wants is very different from what a millennial who's raising a family wants. And you're seeing that really strongly in places like Tampa, where there's just, the city's almost becoming sectionalized, ghettoized. I don't mean that as a negative, but you're definitely getting, retirement communities that stretch as far as the eye can see, and then apartments that can stretch as far as the eye can see, separated from single family homes that stretch as far as the eye can see. And that's even before you get to the bedroom communities and the tourist facilities that are out on the barrier islands, which are completely different. So when you're looking at all of these markets, keep in mind that it's not one market. It's several markets in one, because of the different economic demographic structures that are in play. But on the whole, if you got all these many people moving in, there's something going on that's worth looking at.
Zero state income tax, drawing in a lot of people as well. We're talking about
that does not hurt.
Yeah, we're talking about Florida, which not too long ago became the third most populous state, passing New York on the state population list. Peter, let's move to the west, out toward the Mississippi River in Memphis. Memphis is actually a place where many people have cited that you get the best cap rate on real estate for a metro that size. We're talking about basically the transportation crossroads of the U.S. in some respects. That's where you have the FedEx hub. You're right there on the Mississippi River system. You have a rail confluence. You have interstate highways. Talk to us about the economic fortunes of Memphis, Tennessee.
I've always had my eye on Memphis for specifically the reason that you say. It's at the crossroads of all of the country's major road, water, air, and rail infrastructure.
Yeah.
And because of that, anytime the United States is experiencing relatively reasonable growth in more than one region at the same time, Memphis cannot help but benefit. Now, this is a city that is trying to dust itself off from the globalization era. Anytime globalization does well, Memphis does not. The whole idea of globalization is the United States holds the rest of the world steady so the rest of the world can grow. As the Americans are getting out of that business, you're seeing more and more business come back to the United States, and you're getting that multi-regional growth spurt that normally means Memphis does very well. So Memphis did very well from the turn of the century, 1900, up until about 1960, and then it just kind of dragged from 1960 to 2000. It's only really in the last decade that it's really seen these big growth spurts again. And assuming for the moment that the city government can kind of update itself, I see no reason that Memphis shouldn't be one of the outperforming cities moving forward for the next 30 years.
This is interesting, and it's more optimistically than you talked about Memphis about 2.5 years ago. But hey, time changes some things. Talk to us about Texas, Peter. You touched on it earlier. We're talking about a state where you generally have metros and cities with higher property taxes, but you have a very business-friendly environment in Texas, no state income tax, and just a ton of business growth, business relocation, and population growth. Tell us about Texas.
Texas has some of the country's higher property taxes, but because it has that 0% income tax, you get this interesting dichotomy. Remember that Texas is a big state and it's a relatively flat state, and most of its metro regions can expand in multiple directions without a problem. Those higher property taxes will always be closer to the city core, and so as you go into the suburbs and the exurbs and ultimately the hinterland and the countryside, property taxes drop off. You combine that with a 0% income tax, and it is very easy for a property developer or a business investor to come in and set up shops on the edge of a metro region where not only is the tax profile low, but the ability of people to move in and start new is very low. So I live about 10 miles outside of Austin. My property taxes are 1/4 of what they would be if I lived inside Austin. And so a lot of the investment that is coming into new manufacturing facilities or new businesses in general happens on the outskirts rather than in the core. It's cheaper, easier to attract populations. One of the things that the Texas governorship has gotten right over the last 25 years is kind of, it's really rude. They wait for a state to have financial problems. And when that state is doing the rational things of cutting services and increasing taxes to kind of get their finances back under control, the Texas governor will show up with a few mayors and a few development boards and do a road show in whatever the state happens to be, whether it's California or more recently Illinois. And they'll say, hey, just so you know, we have no state taxes. We have low taxes on everything. If you move your company to Texas, we won't tax you for the first 15 to 20 years. And by the way, here's the mayor of Corpus Christi who can give you all the specifics of what you might need in order to make an informed decision. And every time they come back with several $1 billion of companies, moving shop, it's rude, but it really works and it's really effective. And then the companies stick around, and 20 years later, those companies are no longer in the periphery and all the sunk costs are there. And it's all the stories that you want if you're a metro region for how to build and grow. And so of Texas's top 5 metro regions, all 5 have traditionally been in the top 20 list for fastest growing American cities since 1995.
And I assume we're talking about Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, Houston, and what's the 5th one? Fort Worth or
El Paso. I would include Fort Worth in Dallas, and for those of you who are from Fort Worth, I apologize for making that.
I understand. Yeah, Texas is one state and one area that really felt little pain during the last recession, and I've often thought that, for example, if the Dallas housing market is diversified as Dallas is economically, if that market were feeling pain, I would imagine that most markets in the United States would be feeling pain.
Absolutely. Dallas, Fort Worth, and Austin were the last 2 metro regions in the U.S. to descend into the subprime crisis. They were the first 2 to come out. Austin specifically, the recession here only lasted 3.5 months.
Well, it's a big subject, but we've got to talk about California, the most populous state in the United States. Tell us about California's economic fortunes.
California is the most economically unequal state in the country. You can blame some of this on some of their various regulatory structures. So we all talk about Silicon Valley being the employment base that really matters, and it is. But the regulatory heft has now reached the point that there are no startups in California because they can't afford to operate in California. So usually what happens is they'll start somewhere else. Silicon Valley agents will go out, scout them out, and then just buy them and move their populations entirely to Silicon Valley to be folded into a major company. So you just don't see that forest, that ecosystem of startups that you're used to. And that is really, really exacerbating the inequality issue. It's driven up prices because when you pay several $1 million to buy up a college student startup, that college student comes to California already being a millionaire, and all of his employees are all of a sudden already earning 6 digits, and they can afford to bid up house prices. So the homeless problem that we have in California, for the most part, is because people on the lower end of the income scale have simply been priced out of having homes. That has not yet generated a social crisis in California, but if this keeps up, it will. So that's problem 1. Problem 2 is geographic. The California cities have expanded to almost their maximum iteration now, and their only option is to build up. Now, that's less true for, say, LA as it is for San Diego or San Francisco, but that has generated rents and property prices that are just extreme. And in San Francisco, where you've got vertical limits on how high you can build, it's become worse and worse and worse. So that's problem 2. Problem 3 is international. Because most of California's value added happens in the services and the tech sector and not in manufacturing, they are the state that is most dependent upon international supply chains in order to operate. Because of the regulations on energy and environmental concerns, they are the state that is most dependent on foreign oil in order to operate. So they have become the state most exposed to every problem in the international system, which means with the Americans losing interest in that system, California is the state that has the furthest to fall when this system breaks. So right now, for example, the iPhone is built in 1,200 different facilities in 50 different countries. California, Apple, is dependent upon that network.
Right.
What happens when global trade breaks down? They've got to find a way to retool their entire system to deal with maybe 10% the number of facilities they have right now. That is going to be a hell of an adjustment to make.
Well, speaking of being priced out of homes, there are 2 other places I want to ask you about. The first of those 2 is Seattle. We're talking about a place that's had high property prices among U.S. metros over the last decade or 2. Oftentimes, they have led in appreciation rate. And, for a lot of people, Peter, professionals that can't afford to own near the inner city there in Seattle, it's kind of a situation where you have to, as we say, drive until you qualify. Just keep driving further and further out into the suburbs until you find something you can qualify for. Tell us about the economic fortunes of really what's become one of the more interesting places in the last decade or so with Amazon and everything else, Seattle, Washington.
Now, Seattle has 2 reasons that it has that situation. Number 1, it's one of those gateway cities for capital flight, so you get a bunch of price-insensitive investors coming up and buying whatever they can. So number 1, you got price-insensitive purchasers. Second, it's a land issue. It's a geography issue.
Right.
Seattle, the city of Seattle is on an isthmus. They can only expand up and down the isthmus, and they've pretty much reached all the way to Tacoma and are reaching up towards the border. There's nowhere else to go. So if you can't build, you have to increase your price, and that squeezes everybody out. To a certain degree, that's what's going on in Manhattan. Can you imagine what Manhattan would be if Brooklyn wasn't there? There's just nowhere for the prices to go but up. On the flip side, this is probably more sustainable than what is going on in California. The inequality issue is not nearly as bad. There are a lot of other areas in Washington that you can go that look interesting, and you have near captive companies like Google and Boeing, who have so much money and industrial plants sunk into the metro region that they're not even going to consider moving. That doesn't mean they're always going to be easy to deal with. When the Seattle City Council tried to put a tax into place to generate more affordable housing, Seattle basically said, we will never add another job in Seattle again if you do this.
Right.
So there's a tension, and that is unavoidable. But it's a much better situation than California is finding itself in, because Seattle, Washington, they're not nearly as integrated into global supply chains as the Silicon Valley region is.
Well, let me ask you about a geographic outlier to finish on. A couple years ago, you were here. I asked you about Alaska's economic fortunes. That's the 49th state. Talk to us about the 50th state admitted to the Union, Hawaii, and its economic fortunes, Peter.
Hawaii, you got to remember, it's got a small population. Half of them live in one city. And that one city basically has one east-west road that everybody has to live on. I mean, when your island is a part of a collapsed volcanic cone, you can't really go up. And so everybody's concentrated in this one tiny, tiny little footprint. So, of course, you're going to have price appreciation. Of course, you're going to have horrible traffic. And because it's the first stop for the Japanese come to the United States, of course, you're going to have a lot of foreign capital flight that goes into it. As long as the world is scared or as long as Japan has money to burn, property prices in Honolulu are going to be strong and rising. I don't think it's ever going to come down. You move outside of Honolulu and you don't have a single market. You've got dozens, almost hundreds of markets on the edges of all of these islands that trade on their own mechanics. But the fact remains that all the flat land that is near the coast that people want to live on has already been built on. And so if you want to build there, you have to buy a pre-existing property, level it, and start over. And the regulations for that are a thicket that varies not just island by island and town by town, but oftentimes block by block.
Well, Peter, is there anything I missed, something that I should have asked you but didn't, in relation to how America works with real estate investing, whether that's a Trump policy change or whether that's a particular geography that's particularly noteworthy?
I just keep in mind that now that NAFTA has been renegotiated, the biggest question mark that was hovering over the Mexican economy has been resolved. And I don't think that ratification of NAFTA is going to face meaningful conflict in Congress. I think it'll be ratified this year. So the glide path or the flight path for the Mexican system looks pretty robust. And anyone who's integrated into that, it looks like they're going to do very well. Texas is the state, of course, that's going to benefit that most from that. The Great Plains state and the states of the I-35 corridor are second in line. And that is probably the part of the country that I think is going to be most interesting from an economic growth point of view moving forward.
We talked about how America works today with a decided real estate investing slant and admittedly a geography slant. You get more geography on this show than you do most real estate investing shows. That's a reflection of me and my geography degree and geography interest. Peter, it's been great having you again. Exceedingly few guests could cover a topic like how America works like you can. Tell our audience how they can learn more about you.
The website's www.zeihan.com, and the Twitter handle is @PeterZeihan.com.
Besides getting on his newsletter list, he's someone you should consider as having a speaker at your event, since he can talk to so many things and just understand how everything overlaps, whether that's demography or energy or politics or economics or technology or security. And he's really going to help you and your audience prepare for an uncertain future. Peter Zeihan, it's been a real honor having you back on the show.
Until next time.
Yeah, great stuff from Peter, as always. Well, did we not get to talk about the city where you live or invest? Do you just kind of wish this episode would continue? Well, the good news is that there are a couple ways for you to scratch that itch. Peter was on with us last week, and he was also here earlier, a couple years ago, on both Get Rich Education episodes 101 and 114. The other way to learn more and immerse yourself in the world of Peter is again at zeihan.com. You might want to hire him as a speaker to go big picture at your real estate investing or other event. Next week here on the show, there is no guest. It's just going to be you and I as we get up close and personal with your real estate portfolio. How do you grow it, and how do you get financially free faster? Well, the good news about next week is that you're going to learn that chances are you're one of the hundreds of millions of people that already has money and a substantial amount of your own money that you didn't even know that you had. That material fires me up. I can't wait to talk about it with you next week. Big thanks to Peter Zeihan today. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. It's been my honor to bring you How America Works here on Get Rich Education. Though you might quit your day job, don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
Countless investors get killed on their long-term maintenance costs in their rental property portfolio, but that's far less likely when you buy brand new construction. Let me tell you about my friends at JWB Real Estate Capital in Jacksonville, Florida. They pioneered the build-to-rent model that allows clients like you to invest in new construction, turnkey rental property. That's why JWB has been featured on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and other national media. If you want new construction rental properties in your portfolio, talk to JWB. Give them a call at 904-677-6777 or visit them at newconstructionturnkey.com. The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.